A chilling, sterile white room, the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, and Amelia clutching a life she fought to bring into the world alone. Her millionaire husband, Julian, was supposed to be by her side. Instead, he was with her. But when he finally traded his wife for his mistress, the one person he thought would welcome him with open arms slammed the door in his face. What happens when a man who has everything loses it all in a single day? This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's a story of unexpected alliances and a reckoning no one saw coming. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor hummed a monotonous, soul-crushing tune, a stark contrast to the symphony of chaos erupting in Amelia's world. Lying in the scratchy sheets of the maternity ward bed, she stared at the signed divorce papers Julian's lawyer, a man with a ruthlessly tailored suit and an equally sharp smile, had hand-delivered just an hour after she'd given birth to their daughter Lily. The ink, a bold, unforgiving black, felt like a brand on her soul. Julian Croft. The man whose name was synonymous with tech innovation and old money. The man who had vowed to love her in sickness and in health, had chosen this moment, the most vulnerable, most sacred moment of her life, to sever their ties. He hadn't even bothered to show up. No call, no text, just a legal document delivered with the cold efficiency of a death sentence. Her fingers, still slightly swollen, traced the delicate features of the baby, sleeping peacefully in the bassinet beside her. Lily, a name they had chosen together during a happier time. A time when Julian's laughter wasn't a hollow echo in her memory. She had his dark, silken hair and the same determined set to her tiny chin. A painful, beautiful reminder of the man who was now a ghost. The reason for his spectral presence had a name, Isabella Rossi, a name that dripped with the kind of exotic allure Amelia, a girl from a quiet suburban town, felt she could never compete with. Isabella was an art gallery owner, a woman who moved through the world with a confident, predatory grace, her social media a curated gallery of exclusive parties, European vacations, and intimate moments with Amelia's husband. The affair had been a poorly kept secret, a source of hushed gossip in their elite social circle, and a dagger that had been twisting in Amelia's heart for months. She had confronted him, of course. He had fed her the classic, pathetic lines it meant nothing. It was just a fling. They were working through a rough patch. He'd sworn it was over, that Amelia and the baby were his future. She, desperate to believe in the man she loved, had clung to those lies like a life raft. Now the wreckage of their marriage was all around her, and the life raft had dissolved into splinters. A nurse, a kind-faced woman named Clara, bustled in her presence, a small comfort in the sterile room. "How are our two lovely ladies doing?" she asked, her voice soft. Amelia forced a smile that felt more like a grimace. We're okay." Clara's eyes flickered to the legal documents on the bedside table, and then back to Amelia's pale face, a knowing sadness in her gaze. She'd seen this story play out in different forms too many times. "You have a beautiful, healthy daughter, my dear. That's a miracle right there. You focus on that." The advice was sound, but it was like telling a drowning person to appreciate the view. All Amelia could see was the abyss. Her family had disowned her for marrying Julian, whose family saw her as a gold-digging commoner. She had dropped out of her master's program, at his insistence becoming the perfect corporate wife. Her world had been Julian. Now her world was this tiny, four-walled room, and a future that was a terrifying, gaping void. Meanwhile, across the city, Julian Croft adjusted his tie in the reflection of his penthouse window. The glittering skyline of the city, sprawling beneath him like a conquered kingdom. He felt a pang of something he refused to identify as guilt. He'd instructed his lawyer, Marcus, to handle the hospital situation. It was cleaner that way. Less messy. Amelia was emotional dramatic. The birth would only amplify that. He needed a clean break. He was finally free. The thought should have been exhilarating. For months, the weight of his double life had been suffocating. The lies, the sneaking around, the constant fear of exposure. Now it was done. He had chosen. He had chosen Isabella. He picked up his phone and dialed her number. "It's done," he said, his voice smooth as polished marble. "The papers are delivered. I'm on my way over." There was a pause on the other end of the line, longer than he expected. "Julian." Isabella's voice was different, not the sultry, welcoming purr he was used to. It was cool, distant. "We need to talk." "I know," he said, a touch of impatience in his tone. "We can talk at your place. I'll bring champagne. We're celebrating the first day of our new life." "No, Julian. I don't think you understand," she said, and he could hear the finality in her words, a door slamming shut from miles away. "There is no our new life. You need to listen to me very carefully. Do not come here." Julian's blood ran cold. This wasn't part of the plan. "What are you talking about, Izzy? This is what we wanted. I ended my marriage. For you. You ended your marriage on the day your wife gave birth to your child." She shot back, her voice now sharp as broken glass. "What kind of man does that?" He was stunned into silence. This was the woman who had reveled in their stolen weekends, who had mocked Amelia's provincial sensibilities, who had urged him to leave his boring life behind. "You said you wanted me to be free," he finally managed, his voice rising. "You said you couldn't be with a married man." "And I meant it," Isabella said, "but I thought I was dealing with a man, Julian, not a monster. I may be a lot of things, but I am not the kind of woman who builds her happiness on the wreckage of a new mother and her baby. I thought you would handle this with some semblance of decency, an ounce of class, but this is just cruel. It's disgusting." He could hear the genuine revulsion in her voice, and it terrified him. "Isabella, be reasonable. It's just timing. It had to be done." "No, it didn't have to be done like this," she said. "It shows me who you are. If you can do that to the mother of your newborn child, what would you do to me down the line when you get bored? I'm not interested in finding out. We're done, Julian. I mean it. Lose my number." The line went dead. Julian stood frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear, the silence screaming at him. He looked out at the city lights, but they no longer looked like a kingdom. They looked cold, indifferent, and impossibly far away. He had torched his own life, expecting to walk into a new, brighter one. But he had miscalculated. He had burned down his bridge to the past, only to find the bridge to the future had just been dynamited. He was standing in the smoldering ruins, utterly and completely alone. The silence in the penthouse was a physical entity. It pressed in on Julian, heavy and suffocating. For the first time in his life, the vast open-plan space, with its floor-to-ceiling windows, felt like a tool. He had orchestrated what he believed to be the masterstroke of his personal life, a seamless transition from a stale marriage to a passionate future. Instead, he had written himself into a tragedy of his own making. Isabella's rejection was a blind side, a twist he hadn't accounted for in any of his calculated scenarios. He paced the length of the marble floor, his mind racing, trying to find a loophole, a way to fix this. He redialed her number. It went straight to voicemail. He tried again, and again. The same automated voice, a cold digital tombstone on their affair. He sent a flurry of texts, a desperate cascade of, "I love you, we can fix this, and please just talk to me." The single grey tick of non-delivery was his only reply. She had blocked him. Panic, an unfamiliar and unwelcome emotion, began to claw at his throat. He, Julian Croft, a man who bent the world to his will, had been summarily dismissed, discarded. The irony was a bitter pill. He had treated Amelia as disposable, and in turn Isabella had done the same to him. His mind, a weapon of logic and strategy in the boardroom, was failing him now. It kept replaying Isabella's words. "What kind of man does that? I thought I was dealing with a man, not a monster." The judgment in her voice was more damning than any court verdict. She hadn't just left him. She had passed a moral sentence on him. And in the stark, lonely quiet of his self-imposed exile, he was beginning to suspect she was right. A sudden jarring thought pierced through his self-pity. The baby. Lily. His daughter. He hadn't even seen her. In his haste to begin his new life, he had treated her birth as an inconvenience, a final messy loose end to be tidied away by his lawyer. He scrolled through his phone past the blocked contact for Isabella and hesitated over Amelia's number. What would he even say? "Sorry for the divorce papers. How's the baby I haven't bothered to meet?" His pride warred with a nascent, terrifying sense of regret. He was Julian Croft. He didn't beg. He didn't grovel. But the image of that cold, sterile hospital room, a place he should have been, gnawed at him. He had abandoned his wife, yes. But in doing so, he had also abandoned his own child on the day of her birth. The weight of it settled on him, a crushing physical burden. He sank onto a ludicrously expensive Italian leather sofa that suddenly felt as comfortable as a bed of nails. He had blown up his entire life for a woman who now saw him as a monster. And in the process he had become one. Back in the hospital, Amelia was visited by an unlikely ally. The door to her room swished open, and a woman stood there, impeccably dressed in a charcoal grey power suit, her expression unreadable. It was Victoria Croft, Julian's older sister. Amelia's heart sank. She braced herself for an onslaught of accusations for the classic Croft condescension. Victoria had never approved of her making it clear from day one that Amelia was not their kind. "Victoria Amelia," said, her voice barely a whisper, pulling the thin hospital blanket a little higher, as if for protection. Victoria's sharp eyes took in the scene, the sleeping baby, the divorce papers still on the table, Amelia's exhausted pallor. She stepped fully into the room, her heels clicking softly on the linoleum. She didn't look at Amelia. Her gaze was fixed on the bassinet. "So this is her, Victoria," said her voice surprisingly soft. She moved closer, peering down at Lily. A flicker of something unidentifiable crossed her face. "She looks like a Croft. That stubborn chin. Our father had it." Amelia didn't know how to respond. This was not the attack she had anticipated. Victoria finally turned her gaze to Amelia, and for the first time, Amelia didn't see judgment in her sister-in-law's eyes. She saw a weary resignation and perhaps a hint of shame. "I just came from Julian's." "Victoria," said her tone clipped and businesslike. "He's not well. It seems the Bella Signora Rossi decided my brother's brand of cruelty wasn't to her taste." She kicked him to the curb. Amelia stared at her, stunned. Isabella had left him. The news didn't bring the surge of vindictive pleasure she might have expected. It just added another layer of surrealism to the nightmare. He told me what he did. Victoria continued, her voice laced with disdain. Having Marcus serve you papers. Here. Today. It's a new low even for him. I came here to say, I'm sorry, Amelia. No one deserves that. Our family. We haven't been fair to you. I haven't been fair to you. The apology hung in the air, so unexpected, it felt like a foreign language. And Victoria's gaze hardened. I'm here to tell you that we will not be abandoning you or this child. My brother might be a fool and a coward, but that baby is a Croft. My niece. She will have everything she needs. I will personally see to it. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a checkbook. I've already frozen Julian's access to the family trust. His little stunt will cost him dearly. This is for your immediate expenses. Find the best postnatal care, a new place to live, whatever you need. A proper legal team, not the shark Julian hired, will be in touch tomorrow to discuss your settlement. You will not be left with nothing. Amelia was speechless, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't about the money. It was the validation, the acknowledgement. It was the sight of this formidable woman who had always looked down on her, now standing as her fierce protector. Why, Amelia finally choked out. Victoria looked back at the sleeping baby, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. Because I have spent years watching my brother make selfish, destructive choices. I enabled it. We all did. We let him get away with it because he was the golden boy. But this, she gestured around the room. This ends now. And because that little girl deserves a better family than the one she was born into. And it's my job to make sure she gets it. She looked at Amelia, a steely resolve in her eyes. Get some rest. Heal. Get strong. You're going to need it. We're going to make him regret this. Not out of spite. Out of principle. As Victoria turned and walked out, leaving a stunned Amelia and a check with an astronomical number of zeros on the bedside table. The world outside the hospital room began to shift. The battle lines, once so clearly drawn, were being redrawn in the most unexpected ways. This was no longer just about a failed marriage. It was about to become a war for the soul of the Croft family. And Amelia, the abandoned wife, had just been handed the most powerful weapon of all the unwavering support of her enemy. The days that followed were a blur of logistics and quiet healing for Amelia. True to her word, Victoria Croft became a force of nature, a whirlwind of controlled, efficient fury. A team of lawyers, a discreet but formidable trio from a top-tier family law firm, replaced the predatory shark Julian had sent. They spoke to Amelia with respect, outlining a strategy that was less about a settlement and more about a strategic dismantling of Julian's assets. Victoria has been clear, said the lead attorney, a sharp-witted woman named Eleanor Vance. This isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring the long-term security of you and Lily, and about holding Julian accountable for his fiduciary and moral failures to his family. A luxury postpartum recovery suite was booked a place that felt more like a 5-star hotel than a medical facility. Nannies were interviewed, a temporary security detail was arranged, and a real estate agent was dispatched to find a suitable, unassailable new home. Amelia, who had felt so utterly adrift, was now surrounded by a fortress of support, all orchestrated by the last person she ever expected to be in her corner. She found herself in the strange position of being the calm center of a storm she hadn't started. While lawyers waged war on her behalf, she focused on Lily. She learned the rhythms of her daughter's needs, the soft gurgles, the tiny, grasping fingers, the milky scent of her skin. In the quiet of the night, holding her sleeping child, the pain of Julian's betrayal was still a raw, open wound. But now it was accompanied by a burgeoning sense of strength. She wasn't just a victim, she was a mother, and she had powerful allies. One afternoon, as she was rocking Lily to sleep, her new encrypted phone buzzed, an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Amelia. The voice was tentative female and vaguely familiar. Who is this? It's Isabella Rossi. Amelia's blood ran cold. Her hand tightened on the phone. What do you want? She asked, her voice tight with a mix of anger and dread. I know I am the last person you want to hear from, Isabella, began her voice strained. And I don't expect you to believe me or forgive me. God knows I don't deserve it. But I needed to call. I needed to say, I am so sorry. For everything. Amelia was silent, her mind reeling. I'm not calling to make excuses, Isabella continued, her voice cracking slightly. What I did was wrong. I was selfish, and I was foolish. I let myself believe a fantasy Julian spun, and I ignored the reality of the damage we were causing. When I found out what he did, how he did it, serving you papers in the hospital, it was like a bucket of ice water. It woke me up. I saw the man I had been involved with for who he truly was. And I was disgusted with him, but mostly I was disgusted with myself. She took a shaky breath. I've been doing some thinking about everything, and I've been talking to some people. There are things about Julian, things you should know, things that go beyond what he did to you and me. A chill went down Amelia's spine. What things? His business dealings. The Croft family trust is old and complicated. Victoria controls a large part of it, but Julian has his own ventures. He's been making some very risky, very questionable investments, using leverage in ways that could jeopardize not just his own finances, but the entire family's legacy. I overheard things, saw documents I shouldn't have seen on his laptop. I didn't understand them at the time, but now. She trailed off. He's desperate. That's why he was so eager to lock me down, I think. He thought my family's connections in the art world could be a lifeline for him. He's not just a faithless husband, Amelia. He's a reckless gambler, and he's about to lose the whole house. Amelia didn't know what to say. This revelation was a paradigm shift. Why are you telling me this? Amelia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Because he used both of us, Isabella said, a new hard edge to her voice. He used your love and your stability as a cover, and he used my ambition and connections as his next escape hatch. And he was going to discard us both when we were no longer useful. He abandoned you and your child, and I helped him. That's a stain on my soul I'll never be able to wash away. But maybe I can help make sure he doesn't get away with it. Maybe I can give you the ammunition you need to protect yourself and your daughter. There was a long pause. I have copies, Isabella said quietly, of emails, bank transfers, offshore account information. I shouldn't have them, but I do. They're yours if you want them. Julian, meanwhile, was experiencing the slow, agonizing process of his world shrinking. The freeze on the family trust was a crippling blow. His personal accounts, while substantial, were heavily leveraged against assets he could no longer touch. Calls from his brokers became more frequent. their voices tinged with a nervous edge. The market had taken a downturn, and the high-risk tech ventures he had poured millions into were suddenly looking less like genius investments and more like black holes. He was a pariah. Friends who had once clamored for his company now sent his calls to voicemail. The invitations stopped arriving. He was a man tainted by scandal, not the salacious, exciting kind, but the ugly, pathetic kind. He had committed the ultimate sin in their world. He had been publicly and humiliatingly rejected. He tried to see Victoria to reason with her, but she refused his calls and barred him from the family estate. He was an outcast. One evening, fueled by expensive whiskey and a potent cocktail of rage and self-pity, he did the one thing he swore he wouldn't. He drove to the hospital, not the main entrance, but the discreet exit of the luxury postnatal wing he knew Victoria would have booked. He didn't know what he planned to do. See the baby. Confront Amelia. He just knew he couldn't stand the crushing isolation of his penthouse a moment longer. He saw her. Amelia. She was getting into a black town car, a driver holding the door. She looked different, stronger, more composed than he had seen her in years. There was a quiet dignity in her posture that unnerved him. She was holding a baby carrier, and for a fleeting moment he saw a tiny hand wave in the air. His daughter. A primal surge of possession of rage coursed through him. That was his wife, his child, his life, stolen from him. He got out of his car and strode towards them. Amelia. She froze her hand on the car door and turned. Her eyes widened not with fear, but with a cold, hard clarity. The security guard, a large, imposing man, immediately stepped between them. Mr. Croft, the guard said, his voice a low rumble, I'd advise you to stay back. This is my wife and my child. Julian spat, his voice raw. I have a right to see them. You surrendered that right. Amelia's voice cut through the air, clear and steady, devoid of the tremor he expected. You had your lawyer make that very clear. You are not to come near me or my daughter. He looked past the guard directly at her, his face a mask of desperation. Amelia, please. We need to talk. This is all a misunderstanding. Victoria is trying to ruin me. That woman, Isabella, she's a liar. Amelia gave a small, sad shake of her head. No, Julian. For the first time, everything is perfectly clear. I know about the investments. I know about the shell corporations. I know everything. The blood drained from Julian's face. How could she know? You didn't just abandon your family. Amelia said, her voice ringing with the authority of someone who held all the cards. You were prepared to gamble it away. You were never building a future with me or with her. You were just looking for your next bailout. She gave a curt nod to the security guard. We're leaving. As she slipped into the car, she gave him one last look, a look not of a spurned wife, but of a judge delivering a final verdict. It was a look of pity. The car pulled away, leaving Julian standing on the curb, the guard watching him like a hawk. The whiskey buzz had evaporated, replaced by the icy chill of pure terror. She knew, which meant Victoria knew, which meant Eleanor Vance and her team of legal assassins knew. It wasn't just his marriage that was over. It was his entire world. And he had handed his enemies the matches and the gasoline to burn it to the ground. The documents Isabella provided were the key. Laid out on the polished mahogany table of Eleanor Vance's conference room, The printouts of offshore accounts, encrypted emails, and leveraged loan agreements painted a picture not just of marital infidelity, but of massive, potentially criminal financial malfeasance. Victoria Croft sat at the head of the table, her face a grim mask of resolve. Amelia sat to her right, Lily sleeping peacefully in a state-of-the-art stroller nearby. For the first time, Amelia felt like a participant in her own life again, not just a passenger. Isabella, accompanied by her own lawyer, sat opposite them, looking pale but determined. It was the most unlikely war council ever assembled. He used the Croft family name as collateral for these loans, Eleanor explained, tapping a highlighted paragraph. Without the board's approval, he moved funds through a series of shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands, essentially borrowing from himself on paper to inflate the liquidity of his tech startups. It's a house of cards, and from the looks of this market projection, the wind is picking up. He was planning to use a merger with a European art conglomerate to hide the debt, Isabella added quietly. My father has a seat on their board. Julian was very insistent on meeting him. I see now it wasn't about me. It was about access. Victoria's knuckles were white as she gripped her pen. My father built an empire on integrity. My brother has used our name, our legacy, to build a fantasy on a foundation of lies. He has risked everything. Her gaze shifted to Amelia, then to the sleeping baby. Everything he was meant to protect. What does this mean legally? Amelia asked, her voice steady. It means, Eleanor said, a glint in her eye, that we are no longer just negotiating a divorce settlement. We are now in a position to reclaim assets that were fraudulently misappropriated from the family trust. In essence, we can prove that much of what Julian considers his money is in fact stolen property. It gives us leverage to strip him of his board seat, his voting rights, and a significant portion of his personal net worth to cover the debts he has incurred against the family name. It was a total financial annihilation, a complete checkmate. Victoria nodded slowly. Do it. As the meeting concluded and the lawyers began drafting the motions, a strange sense of solidarity hung in the room. Victoria placed a hand on Amelia's shoulder. You are doing the right thing, Amelia, for your daughter. You are protecting her future. Then she turned to Isabella. The air crackled with tension. Miss Rosie Victoria, said her voice formal, but no longer dripping with ice. You did not have to do this. You could have simply walked away. Why, Isabella met her gaze directly. Because your brother reminded me of my own father, she said, her voice low and laced with an old pain. A charming man who builds a world for his family and then becomes reckless with it. My mother paid the price for his mistakes. I helped Julian become the kind of man I've always despised. This is my penance and my warning, for Amelia and for her daughter, so she never has to pay the price for her father's sins. The confession, raw and unexpected, changed the atmosphere in the room. It wasn't about sides anymore. It was about three women all wronged by the same man, now united in a common cause. For Julian, the fallout was swift and brutal. It began with a summons delivered to his penthouse by a stoic process server. It wasn't just a divorce filing. It was a comprehensive lawsuit from the Croft family trust, with his own sister as the lead plaintiff. The allegations were laid out in cold black and white detail. Fraud, misappropriation of funds, breach of fiduciary duty. His bankers, who had once courted him, now treated him like a contagion. His lines of credit were frozen. Margin calls came one after another, each one a hammer blow to his crumbling financial empire. The tech startup, starved of the fraudulent capital he'd been pumping into them, began to fold. The house of cards was collapsing in on itself, exactly as Eleanor Vance had predicted. He was trapped. Every asset he tried to liquidate was already encumbered by the lawsuit. He was a millionaire on paper, but in reality, he was broke. He had to sell his sports car to cover his initial legal fees. He let his housekeeping staff go. The penthouse, once a symbol of his power, became a dusty, silent prison. The panoramic views of the city were a constant mocking reminder of the world he had lost. Desperate, he tried to rally support from old business partners, but the Croft name, wielded by Victoria, was a weapon he could not defend against. She was systematically dismantling his reputation, cutting him off from every source of power and influence he had ever cultivated. He was left with nothing but his own hubris. He started drinking earlier and earlier in the day, the expensive whiskey his only companion. He would stare at the few photos he had of Amelia from their early happy years. He tried to pinpoint the exact moment it had all gone wrong, the single decision that had led him to this ruin. Was it meeting Isabella? Was it the first lie he told? Or was it something deeper, a flaw in his own character, that had been there all along? One night, in a drunken haze, he found himself scrolling through a gossip blog on his phone. And then he saw it, a picture of Amelia walking in a park. She was pushing a stroller, laughing at something someone off camera had said. She looked radiant, beautiful, and utterly at peace. Beside her, holding a shopping bag and smiling, was Isabella Rossi. And walking on Amelia's other side, pointing at something in the distance for the baby to see, was his sister, Victoria. The caption read, "New Power Trio. Amelia Croft." Victoria Croft and former rival Isabella Rossi form an unlikely alliance, proving that sisterhood is powerful, and hell hath no fury like three women scorned. Julian stared at the image, his world tilting on its axis. It wasn't just a lawsuit. It wasn't just about money. They had formed a new family, a family built from the ashes of the one he had destroyed, and he was not and would never be a part of it. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had not just lost his wife, his mistress, his fortune, and his family. He had lost his place in the world. He had sought ultimate freedom and had found himself in the ultimate prison, a solitary confinement of his own making. The laughter in that photo, the easy camaraderie, the life he could have had. It was a paradise, and he was the angel who had been permanently cast out. He finally understood the true nature of his loss. He had given up everything for nothing, and in doing so, had lost himself. The screen of the tablet cracked under the force of Julian's grip before he hurled it across the room. It shattered against a marble column, the image of the three smiling women, his wife, his sister, his mistress dissolving into a spiderweb of broken glass. The sound echoed in the cavernous, empty penthouse, a fitting soundtrack to the demolition of his life. He sank to the floor, the expensive whiskey doing nothing to numb the new terrifying clarity. The photo hadn't just shown him what he had lost. It had shown him that he had been replaced, utterly and completely. In his self-imposed drama, he had always been the protagonist. Now he saw the truth. He was merely the catalyst, the villain in the origin story of a new, unexpected alliance. They hadn't just moved on. They had evolved, bonding over his destruction and building something stronger in his place. The loneliness was a physical entity, a cold, heavy presence in the room. He had sought freedom and had achieved only isolation. He had chased passion and was left with ashes. For days he barely moved the penthouse, growing darker and dustier around him, a mausoleum for the man he used to be. The legal notices piled up unopened. The finality was too much to bear. One rain-slicked afternoon, driven by a desperation that transcended pride, he took a taxi to the address he'd gleaned for Amelia's new residence. It was a stately, discreet brownstone in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. He stood across the street, drenched and disheveled, a ghost at the gates of a life that was no longer his. He didn't know what he wanted. Forgiveness. A fight to see his daughter. He just knew he couldn't bear the silence any longer. The front door opened, but it wasn't Amelia who emerged. It was Victoria. She held a large black umbrella, her posture as rigid and unyielding as ever. She saw him instantly, her expression not of surprise, but of weary inevitability. She crossed the street, her heels clicking with resolute purpose on the wet pavement, and stopped a few feet from him. "Go home, Julian," she said, her voice flat, devoid of heat. It was worse than anger. It was indifference. "I want to see her," he croaked, his voice raw. "Amelia. And the baby. Her name is Lily." Victoria corrected him coldly. "And no, you will not see them. You gave up that right. Remember Victoria, please." He begged the word, tasting like acid in his mouth. He was Julian Croft. He did not beg. But he was no longer that man. "You're my sister. This is my family." A flicker of something pain, regret, disgust crossed her face. "Family. You used our family's name to commit fraud. You brought shame and scandal to a legacy our father spent his life building. You abandoned your wife on the day she gave birth to your child. That is not what family does. You are a liability we have cut loose." She reached into her coat and pulled out an envelope. "The board has reached a final decision. In exchange for you relinquishing all claims, all titles, and your name from any future business, and to avoid criminal prosecution, which I assure you you would not survive the trust, has allocated you a one-time final payment. It's enough for you to disappear and live quietly. But it is not enough for you to ever be Julian Croft again." She pushed the envelope into his hand. "This is the last thing you will ever receive from us. Do not contact me again. Do not try to see Amelia or Lily again. Legal measures have been taken. You are now, for all intents and purposes, a stranger to us." She turned and walked away without a backward glance, leaving him standing in the rain, clutching the envelope that was both his salvation and his life sentence. He had been officially, irrevocably erased. A year later, the Croft Rossi Foundation for Women and Children was celebrating its first anniversary with a gala. The ballroom was filled with the city's most influential figures, but the center of attention was the three women on the stage. Victoria, in her role as chairwoman, spoke of financial literacy and empowerment. Isabella, head of outreach, spoke of creating safe spaces and second chances. And then Amelia, the foundation's president, stepped to the podium. She looked poised, her voice clear and strong as she spoke of resilience, of turning pain into purpose. A year ago, she said, her eyes sweeping across the room. Many of us in this room, myself included, learned that the lives we planned are not always the lives we get. But we also learned that your greatest strength is not found when things are easy. It is forged in the fire. It is discovered when you have no choice but to stand up, not just for yourself, but for those who cannot yet stand for themselves. In the front row, a nanny held a giggling 1-year-old Lily, who clapped her hands, her dark hair, a familiar echo. Across town, in a small, clean apartment, that was utterly anonymous. Julian Croft watched the gala on a local news broadcast. He was sober thinner, haunted by a quiet that had become his constant companion. He saw Amelia on the screen, a woman he barely recognized. The timid, accommodating girl he had married was gone, replaced by this confident, powerful leader. He saw the genuine admiration in the faces of his sister and his former lover as they looked at her. He had orchestrated his own downfall so spectacularly that he had inadvertently created his own replacement, a better version of the world he'd left behind. They were everything he wasn't, united, purposeful, and content. As Amelia finished her speech to a standing ovation, Julian quietly turned off the television, plunging his small apartment into darkness. There was nothing left to watch. His story was over. Hers was just beginning. 5 years passed. 5 years of sense of atonement, of erasure. In a dreary, anonymous city hundreds of miles from the glittering spires of his past, Julian Croft had ceased to exist. In his place was John Anderson, a man who managed shipping logistics with quiet competence, lived in a small, sparsely furnished apartment, and spoke to almost no one. The severance from the Croft Trust, a sum that would seem a fortune to most, but was a pittance to him, was managed with a miser's care. It was his penance, and he lived it every day. He had kept his promise. He had vanished. But while the world had forgotten Julian Croft, the man who was once him could not. The ghost of his daughter was his constant, silent companion. He marked her birthdays on a plain wall calendar, the only decoration in his sterile living space. On those days, he would buy a single pink frosted cupcake from a local bakery place, a candle in it, and watch it burn down the flame reflected in his haunted eyes. He imagined the parties, the gifts, the laughter he would never be a part of. He followed the Croft Rossi Foundation's progress with the obsessive dedication of a zealot. He learned to navigate the internet through proxies and anonymous accounts, finding obscure local news coverage of their charity, galas, studying photos from the events. He saw his Amelia, transform. The tentative woman he had married was gone, replaced by a leader of formidable grace and confidence. He felt a strange, hollowed-out pride that ached like a phantom limb, mingled with the ever-present burn of regret. He even made small, anonymous donations to the foundation wiring funds through a labyrinth of accounts, a pathetic secret tithe paid to the family he had forsaken. One crisp autumn afternoon, his carefully constructed exile was breached by an accident of fate. A rare, unavoidable business trip brought him back to his former city. He told himself he would stay in his hotel, that he wouldn't tempt the ghosts of his past. But an irresistible force pulled him, and he found himself walking through a park, the very park near the brownstone he knew Amelia called home. He told himself it was a coincidence, a trick of a lonely mind. But then he saw them. Amelia was sitting on a bench, her head tilted back as she laughed, the sound carried towards him on the breeze. It was the same genuine, unburdened laugh he remembered from their earliest days, a sound he thought he had killed forever. Running on the grass, her small form silhouetted against the fiery golds and reds of the autumn leaves, was a little girl with his own dark, silken hair, and the same determined set to her tiny chin. Lily, no longer the infant in his memory, but a vibrant, living, breathing person. Julian's breath caught in his throat. He stumbled backward, pressing himself against the rough bark of an ancient oak tree, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was a spectator at the premiere of a life that should have been his. He watched as Lily, chasing a swirling eddy of leaves, tripped and fell. A small cry of surprise, not pain, escaped her. In an instant, Amelia was there, scooping her up, her movements fluid, with the easy practice of motherhood. She knelt on the grass, whispering comforts, kissing a knee that wasn't really scraped, and within seconds, the little girl's tears turned to giggles. The scene was so simple, so perfect, so devastatingly ordinary. It was every mundane moment of fatherhood he had willingly forfeited. This, he realized with a clarity that was a new circle of hell, was the true fortune he had squandered. Not the money, not the power, but this: the right to kiss a scraped knee. He stayed hidden until they packed up their things and walked away hand in hand, their figures shrinking in the fading light. He was a phantom left alone in the dusk, the image of his daughter's smiling face burned into his soul. The sterile silence of his hotel room was a roaring torment. The encounter had shattered his fragile, monotonous peace. For 5 years he had accepted his punishment, believing his absence was a necessary sacrifice. But seeing her had changed the calculus. He was her father. Did she even know he existed? Or was he just a vague, monstrous shadow in her story? The thought of her growing up hating a man she'd never met, a villain in a story she didn't understand, was a torture beyond anything he had yet endured. He could not storm back into their lives. He had no right. But could he live the rest of his life as nothing more than a ghost? He found a pen and a cheap notepad from the hotel desk and began to write. It was not a demand or a plea, but a confession. The first few pages were stilted, full of false starts. But then something broke within him, and the words began to pour out, a torrent of memory and regret. He wrote for weeks, first in the hotel, then back in his apartment, the pages piling up. He wrote of his own father, a cold, demanding man who equated love with success. He wrote of the crushing weight of the Croft name, of feeling like an imposter in his own life. He did not offer these as excuses, but as a desperate attempt at context. He wrote about Isabella, describing the affair not as a grand passion, but as a cowardly escape from a marriage he didn't have the courage to either fix or end honorably. And then, with searing, self-lacerating detail, he wrote about the day of Lily's birth. He confessed his terror, his moral cowardice, the selfish, catastrophic miscalculation that had cost him everything. He wrote of seeing his daughter in the park 5 years later, of the overwhelming, unconditional love that had ambushed him, a pure, painful emotion, untainted by the pride or possession that had defined his old life. He ended the manuscript, for it had become one with a simple, terrifying proposition. I do not ask for your forgiveness, Amelia. I have no right to it, and I will not force myself into Lily's life. I surrendered that right forever. But I ask you to consider this: one day she will have questions, and I have written the truth for her. It is an ugly, shameful truth, but it is a part of her story. I am sending this to your lawyer, Eleanor Vance. It is for you to keep, to burn, to share with Lily when you feel the time is right, or to ignore completely. I will abide by your decision, whatever it may be, without protest. That is my final promise. I simply want her to know, if you ever choose to let her, that her father, for all his monstrous faults, loved her enough to finally tell her the truth. He packaged the thick manuscript and sent it to Eleanor's office. The act felt like leaping from a cliff into a dark, unknown sea. He had relinquished the last vestige of control he possessed, placing his legacy as a father entirely into the hands of the woman he had wronged most of all. A week later, Amelia sat in the quiet of her study, the city a distant, glittering tapestry below. The thick parcel from Eleanor lay on her polished desk. She had stared at it for a full day, before finally slitting it open. her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and a curiosity she hated to admit. As she read, her carefully constructed composure began to disintegrate. The Julian in these pages was not the charming man she'd once loved, nor was he the one-dimensional monster who had abandoned her. This was a man stripped bare, his soul laid out in unflinching, excruciating detail. His words were not manipulative. They were a raw, brutal autopsy of his own character. She saw not a villain, but a tragic, deeply flawed human being, a product of a gilded cage she had never fully understood. The fortress she had built around her heart trembled. For 5 years, the story of Lily's father had been a simple, necessary one. He was a man who had made bad choices and had to go away. But this letter, this confession, shattered that simplicity. Lily, asleep in her room down the hall, deserved the truth, didn't she? But was this a truth that would heal her, or a poison that would curdle the perfect, safe world Amelia, Victoria, and Isabella had so painstakingly built for her? She held the letter, the sheer physical weight of it immense. She knew she could not make this decision alone. The next day, she called a meeting, not in a boardroom, but in her sun-drenched living room. Victoria and Isabella sat opposite her, their expressions shifting from curiosity to stunned gravity as Amelia explained the arrival of the manuscript. "He wants nothing." Amelia finished, her voice unsteady. "No contact, no visitation. Just to be known. On my terms." Victoria, ever the pragmatist, spoke first. "Burn it," she said, her voice clipped resolute. "Amelia, we have spent 5 years building a world for Lily that is safe and stable, a world without his chaos. Why would you invite the ghost back into the house? He is a story, a sad one, but one that is finished. Let it stay that way, that way." "But is it finished?" Isabella countered softly, her eyes full of a familiar pain. "My father, he was never capable of this kind of honesty. I spent my life wishing he would just once explain himself, even if the explanation was ugly. A lie, even a kind one, is a cage. This manuscript, it might be a key for Lily, a way for her to understand a part of herself without having to endure the man himself." "You're romanticizing him," Victoria shot back. "This is a man who committed fraud, who abandoned his child. And he admits to it all in his own words," Isabella insisted, leaning forward. "That's the point. He isn't hiding. For the first time, he's not hiding. Don't you see the power in that giving Lily the truth when she is old enough lets her be the judge? It trusts her." Amelia listened, her head spinning. Victoria was offering protection. Isabella was offering truth. Both were born of love for Lily. She looked from one to the other, the two women who had become her rocks, her sisters. They had helped her slay the dragon, but now his voice was echoing from the past, and they were divided on how to answer. Her story, she had thought, was over. His was over. But she realized with a dawning, terrifying clarity that as long as they had a child, their stories would forever be intertwined. And Julian Croft, the ghost she had banished, was asking for one last thing. The choice to shield her daughter within the perfect safety of their world, or to arm her with a complex and painful truth, was hers alone. And as she looked towards the hallway, where her daughter slept, she had no idea what to do. In the end, Julian Croft, the man who thought he could discard people like last season's assets, was left with only the echoes of his own bad decisions. He lost more than a fortune. He lost the future. This story serves as a powerful, raw reminder that integrity is the one currency you can't afford to go bankrupt on. The bonds between Amelia Victoria and even Isabella, forged in the fires of betrayal, created a new kind of family, one built on strength, resilience, and mutual respect. They didn't just survive, they thrived. If their incredible story of justice and unexpected alliances moved you, please hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who needs to see that even from the deepest betrayals, strength can emerge. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next real-life drama.